On June 14th, 2018, Attorney General Jeff Sessions chose to defend the Trump administration's practice of separating families on both legal and religious grounds. Like many of you, I was sickened by the sight of children being taken from their parents, and I was frightened by the justification that the Trump administration used for this practice. Attorney General Jeff Sessions, in his justification, was wrong about the law. He was wrong about the Bible. He was wrong about God. And here's why it matters. I'd like to respond to Attorney General Jeff Sessions one comment at a time. Here he is.
I thought I'd take a little bit of digression here to discuss some concerns raised by our church friends about separation of families.
I appreciate the fact that it was the religious community that was putting pressure on the Trump administration. And as a pastor, I'm proud that the religious community of Jews, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, and others are telling the Trump administration that their action is illegal, it's immoral, it's unjust, and it's not fair. Now back to the Attorney General.
Many of the criticisms raised in recent days are not fair, not logical, and some are contrary to plain law.
I'd like to show that it is actually the Trump administration's policy that is not just, that is not fair, and is contrary to not only the law, but to common sense in the United States. And here's the Attorney General again.
First, illegal entry into the United States is a crime. It should be, it must be, if you're going to have a legal system and have any limits whatsoever. Persons who violate the law of our nation are subject to prosecution. If you violate the law, you subject yourself to prosecution.
Attorney General Sessions' argument hinges on the idea that you're subject to prosecution, which is why on April 11th, he wrote a memo changing the policy of prosecution. He wrote about his memo on the Department of Justice website 5 days before he signed it, writing, "The situation on the southern border is unacceptable. Congress has failed to pass effective legislation that serves the national interest, that closes dangerous loopholes and funds a wall along our southern border. As a result, a crisis has erupted on the southern border that necessitates an escalated effort to prosecute those who illegally cross our borders." It was not the law itself, but your determination that prosecutions should change, Mr. Attorney General, that caused this crisis. As you put it, that necessitates an escalated effort to prosecute. That's what caused this crisis. And importantly, these families are overwhelmingly not illegal immigrants. They are asylum seekers. They are from Nicaragua, Guatemala, El Salvador, and other places where their lives are in jeopardy. The Trump administration, for the first time in the history of our country, has chosen to declare asylum seekers as illegal immigrants. And they're not receiving due process of law. Both asylum seekers and illegal immigrants in our country are entitled to the presumption of innocence and a trial. Your orders violate that commitment and allow arresting officials to become both judge and jury. And a 3-year-old is not culpable of a crime. And then Attorney General Sessions seeks to justify this illegal activity on religious grounds. And here's where it gets really dangerous. For the top law enforcement officer in our country to use the Bible as the justification for legal action is anti-American and scary on its face. And as it turns out, he even gets the Bible wrong. Here's what he says.
I would cite you to the Apostle Paul and his clear and wise command in Romans 13 to obey the laws of the government because God has ordained the government for his purposes.
Yes, there's clear and wise counsel in the book of Romans, but obey the law of the government because God has ordained the government for his purposes, that's simply not in there. The closest thing from Romans 13 might be this opening paragraph. This might be what he's referring to, where it reads, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authorities is rebelling against God and whatever God has instituted. And those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. Now, there's a lot in there. But what's not in there is the line, obey the laws of the government because God has ordained the government for his purposes. Paul is talking about fighting against human authorities and the harm that will come to you as a person. He is not arguing for following the laws because somehow it hurts God. Not following the law is not resisting the authority that Paul was talking about. Paul in Romans 13 and Jeff Sessions on June 14th, they're talking about really different things. Attorney General Sessions rephrasing is not only out of line with the actual words that are in Romans 13, but they're totally out of line with anything in the Apostle Paul's life or Jesus for that matter. There's nothing in their lives that would have concluded that the act of the faithful should be to obey the laws of the government. Paul is not in some blanket support of all laws set out by all governments. Paul writes this very letter to the Romans and then is imprisoned by the Roman government for his righteousness. Jesus was crucified as a criminal by the Roman government. This is not what Paul is talking about, that we should obey the laws because that's the same as obeying God. And this line of thinking simply makes no sense in the United States of America. Our country is organized as a government of the people, by the people. It's not to take every law as if it came from God. So in the United States, if this were ever a law that we should separate parents from their children as punishment for being an asylum seeker, then we should change that law. Our laws are not irrefutable, everlasting truths. We wrote them, we can change them. This broad overuse by Jeff Sessions defiles the meanings of the comments by Paul, because what laws would then not be from God? They all would in all countries, all laws. Of course, that's not what he's talking about. And here's where Attorney General Sessions' comments take an even scarier turn. He suggests that it's the very orderliness as determined by the government that makes a law right and just in its own right. Here's what he says.
Orderly and lawful processes are good in themselves. Consistent, fair application of law is in itself a good and moral thing, and that protects the weak. It protects the lawful.
What is so frightening about this line of argument is that it's the same logic that was used to forcibly return slaves to their slave owners in the 1850s. You could swap out these terms and this argument with so many of the atrocities that our laws have caused over the years in this country, that arguing that by their very existence, following them makes them right. Laws simply being right because they exist, that is not the American way. By that logic, we wouldn't change any laws. We wouldn't even have a United States of America distinct from England. We wouldn't have any social change movements. And since the Attorney General brought up the Christian religious teachings, we wouldn't have any modern day Apostle Pauls or people following in the way of Jesus, both people who live their lives in opposition to any immoral system of power. It is right laws and just laws that protect us, not the consistent application of any prosecutorial discretion that the Attorney General decides. On a further note, since Attorney General Sessions picked Romans 13, when one reads a bit further, there's other clear and wise counsel that he might find interesting in there, like this section where you should pay your taxes. It reads, you should pay taxes for the same reason, because the authorities are God's assistants. So pay everyone what you owe them, pay the taxes you owe. Is Attorney General Sessions going to follow up with all of us on tax day and encourage us by biblical admonition to pay our taxes? It goes on then to say that love is actually our obligation to one another, not the fulfillment of the law. Don't be in debt to anyone except the obligation to love each other. Whoever loves another person has fulfilled the law. The commandments: do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not desire what others have, or any of these other comments. They're all summed up in one word. You must love your neighbor as yourself. And then it finishes with this great line: love doesn't do anything wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is what fulfills the law. So, Attorney General Sessions, if you need some help figuring out who your neighbor is, you can pick that up at a lesson in most churches. And if your church doesn't teach that lesson, that your neighbor includes these people seeking asylum from their countries, then come on over to Solomon's Porch some Sunday and we'll help you learn that one.